Hey guys, tonight we wander into the fogged alleys of a story that slices through the very fabric of New York's underworld. Picture this. It's early morning on a Brooklyn dock. Salt sticks to your skin. The clink of chains echoes off freighters, and among the grime and crates, a boy no older than 13 moves like he belongs to no one. His shoes don't fit. His accent is thicker than his coat. And his silence? It's already sharper than most men's words. That boy. His name is Umberto Anastasia, though you'll come to know him as Albert Anastasia. And tonight, we'll follow him from his barefoot steps across rusted planks all the way to a gleaming barbershop floor in 1957, where history caught up to him with 5 bullets and no goodbyes. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I always love seeing how far these stories drift. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The steamship SS Canada creaks into New York Harbor in 1917, carrying one less passenger than the manifest promised. Somewhere in steerage, a Calabrian teenager has slipped from the records, likely with help from a cousin already on the inside. This was not uncommon for the time. Names reshuffled, ages blurred, birthplaces edited until Ellis Island looked more like fiction than fact. And so Umberto becomes Albert, because it sounds more American, more employable. In a land that didn't care how you arrived, just how quietly you worked. He vanished into Brooklyn's Italian enclaves like a stone dropped in a dark pond. Brooklyn then isn't quite the borough you know today. It's smoke-stung and cruel. Tenements lean like exhausted drunks. Laundry swings between windows, and immigrant kids form kingdoms in alleys. Albert fits right in. He's wiry and alert, with dark eyes that scan before stepping, and fists that answer insults better than his shaky English. He finds work on the docks, a boy with too much strength and too little patience. He carries crates, scrubs decks, sharpens blades, but it's not long before the edges of legal labor blur. Dock work is unionized, but the unions are mobs unto themselves. Pay envelopes depend on favors, and favors cost. One afternoon, an older man named Joe the Blade Accardi hands Albert a knife and asks him to teach a lesson to someone who miscounted crates. The boy doesn't flinch. He doesn't ask why. And that night, a foreman limps home with a cut too clean to have come from a novice. Years later, when newspapers call him the Mad Hatter of Murder, Inc., you'll remember that cut. By 1920, Albert is well known among the Brooklyn longshoremen, feared not because he talks loud, but because he doesn't. He listens. He waits. And when he strikes, it's surgical. The kind of violence that doesn't look angry. Just organized. Many people still think that these early years shaped his strange code. Never start the fight, but never leave one unfinished. He meets Vincent Mangano around this time, a local enforcer already tied to the D'Aquila crime family. Mangano sees potential in this silent teen and offers him protection, and more importantly, a ladder. Albert climbs fast. He learns how to collect debt without raising his voice, how to fix a vote without ever entering the ballot room. By 22, he's no longer just feared. He's respected. Still, his world shifts when he meets Charles Lucky Luciano at a warehouse meetup over a shipment of stolen textiles. Luciano is already a comet in the criminal world, charismatic, brilliant, and tired of the old Sicilian ways. Albert watches him with quiet admiration. Lucky, in turn, notices the stillness of the Calabrian kid, the way he doesn't blink, the way he doesn't ask twice. One night, after a quiet favor involving a troublesome loan shark and an alley behind a Coney Island diner, Lucky places a hand on Albert's shoulder and says, "You're not built for noise, are you?" Albert shrugs. Noise wastes time. That line sticks. There's a historical document, FBI files from the 1950s, that describe Albert as a man capable of terrible calm. The agents couldn't reconcile his polite manner with the rumors surrounding him, that he once killed a man with a single pencil stab, that he never needed a gun to make people disappear. These weren't exaggerations. They were just rarely proven. In 1923, Albert's world nearly caves in. He's arrested for murder, blunt force trauma, body found in the East River. Witnesses point fingers, but somehow the case unravels. 2 key testimonies recant. 1 witness disappears entirely. A 3rd is later found to have been paid off by an unnamed benefactor. Many believe this was the first time Albert understood the real currency of power. Not bullets, but silence. He walks free, and with that trial, his myth begins. Throughout the 20s, Albert becomes the go-to man for problems. Not flashy ones. The quiet kind. A numbers runner who keeps shaving the take. A cousin who won't return money. A witness getting too brave. Albert's name is never spoken aloud, but the whispers are always the same. Let the barber take care of it. It's a nickname he hates because it reminds him of those early dock days when he actually swept hair for coins. By the time Prohibition sinks its teeth into New York, Albert's knife is more feared than most men's guns. He doesn't run booze. He doesn't party. He doesn't even gamble much. He just removes obstacles, one by one, cleanly, quietly. And here's where the story sharpens. In 1929, Luciano orchestrates what becomes known as the Night of the Sicilian Purge. A dozen old-world bosses are eliminated to clear space for a more Americanized mafia structure. Albert is said to have handled at least 3 of those hits. No one sees him. No one hears him. But they find the bodies. So what do you think? Is a man still guilty when there's no proof? Just the echo of a footstep and the quiet agreement that something's been handled? Even now, historians debate how involved Albert truly was in the Luciano Revolution. Some argue he was merely a tool. Others believe he was the silent strategist behind half the executions. But one thing is certain. By 1930, Albert Anastasia is no longer just a knife on the docks. He's a name whispered in fear, a ghost in polished shoes, a shadow that always leaves room at the table. And somewhere, Lucky Luciano smiles. His quiet protege has become a lord. The year is 1931, and the underworld of New York is being redrawn like a city map under siege. The old guard is dying, sometimes literally, and the new faces are making deals in fine suits over whiskey, not in bloodied aprons behind butcher shops. At the heart of this new order sits the quiet man with heavy-lidded eyes and a face that rarely betrays emotion. Albert Anastasia. It's around this time that Murder, Inc. begins to take form. Not in name, not yet, but in quiet practice. There are simply too many disputes, too many grudges, too many warnings gone ignored. So someone, perhaps it was Lucky, perhaps it was Albert, asks a dangerous question. What if there was a crew that handled death like an assignment? No feuds, no vendettas, just business. Albert doesn't volunteer to lead it. But he doesn't say no either. He steps into the role like someone putting on a jacket that fits a little too well. The crew assembles from various boroughs. Louis Lepke Buchalter, who brings cold calculations, Mendy Weiss, whose hands seem allergic to hesitation, and Bugsy Siegel, who adds a bit of manic flair. But it's Albert who makes the killings feel like procedure. Clinical, inevitable. The hitmen are mostly Jewish and Italian, working together in a rare display of unity. It's ironic. Murder brings harmony. They set up in a candy store in Brownsville, Brooklyn. The storefront sells sweets. The back room sells silence. Albert trains his men with precision. No flashy hits, no unnecessary violence. He emphasizes control. "If it bleeds all over the sidewalk," he reportedly says once, "you weren't paying attention." Mainstream history sometimes glamorizes Murder Inc. Films and books make it a kind of dark legend. But the truth is more chilling than romantic. Over 400 murders are linked to the group in less than a decade. Most go unsolved. Some bodies are never found. Others are displayed as warnings, carefully posed with messages only certain men can read. Many people still think that Albert took part in at least 70 of those hits personally. That number isn't official, but the way insiders flinch at his name makes it feel close enough. He becomes known as the Lord High Executioner, a title that seems both dramatic and accurate. Still, in public, Albert keeps a strange decorum. He dines quietly, tips generously, and never raises his voice. His neighbors describe him as a gentle man with haunted eyes. His enemies never get close enough to describe anything. In 1932, Albert faces his most delicate task yet. A young bookmaker named Teddy Resnick has been skimming from Lepke's operation in the Bronx. He's not subtle about it. Brags in bars, throws parties too lavish for his earnings. Lepke wants him gone. Albert, instead of sending a hitman, visits Teddy personally. They meet in a smoke-thick diner at 2 a.m. Albert doesn't order food. He just sits, staring across the table. The silence stretches. Teddy tries to talk, nervous jokes, sweaty hands, but Albert says nothing. Finally, he stands, leaves a few dollars for the waitress, and says, "You have until tomorrow night." Teddy skips town that afternoon. No one sees him again. No one has to. This is Albert's real power, not the violence itself, but the threat of it. A presence that makes knees weaken without lifting a finger. But not all ghosts stay in shadows. In 1933, Albert is arrested again, this time in connection with a man found buried in a shallow Queens grave, a low-level mob courier. The evidence is circumstantial, but it sticks just enough to land Albert in a courtroom. Cameras flash, headlines scream. "Executioner on trial," one paper writes, as if they're auditioning for noir fiction. And then, as before, witnesses evaporate. The key informant recants. A second disappears before testifying. The jury deliberates for just a few hours. Verdict: not guilty. Reporters wait outside the courthouse. Albert walks down the steps, his coat draped neatly over one arm. When asked what he'll do next, he replies, "Get a shave." He doesn't smile. It's around this time that the FBI begins to obsess over him. Internal memos label him as coldly terrifying and disarmingly courteous. One agent notes that Albert speaks like a man who believes he's already died once and isn't worried about doing it again. Despite the attention, his power only grows. By 1935, Albert has become the primary enforcer, not just for Murder Inc., but for the wider Five Families network. He handles disputes, oversees punishments, and ensures that internal order remains intact. He's not a boss in name, but his presence lingers like incense in every backroom meeting. He also begins cultivating a peculiar image. He keeps his nails manicured, his suits pressed, and his shoes always polished. He becomes a symbol of controlled menace. A blade so well honed, you barely see it before the cut appears. Yet even within this empire of calculated fear, he has rules. He doesn't kill women. He avoids unnecessary blood. He punishes those who act rashly. Many believe this is his warped version of honor, a code buried beneath layers of pragmatism. And then there's the cigar, always unlit, always resting between his fingers like a punctuation mark. It becomes part of his image. When he walks into a room with that cigar, people sit straighter. Conversations pause, because if he sets it down, it usually means something's about to end. There's a famous story, possibly apocryphal, but delicious all the same, about Albert walking into a card game where a bookmaker owed money to the wrong people. Instead of drawing a weapon, Albert picks up a slice of cheesecake, eats it slowly while maintaining eye contact with the debtor, and then sets the plate down with surgical precision. The man paid double the next morning. No threats, just presence. What's fascinating is how little Albert leaves behind in writing. No diaries, no recorded interviews. He remains an enigma. Even the few surviving photos of him seem blurry around the edges, as if he refused to be fully captured. By the late 30s, Murder Inc. is a machine. Hits are ordered like invoices. Albert oversees it all, rarely flinching, rarely delegating the tough ones. He starts sleeping in shifts, 3 hours here, 2 there, because he claims dreams waste time. He avoids crowds, prefers back alleys, always knows the nearest exit. And still, he's not a boss, not yet. That changes in 1940, when Vincent Mangano, his longtime ally and nominal superior, begins to grow suspicious. Mangano's old school. He doesn't like that Albert deals with Jews like Lepka and Siegel. He doesn't like the idea of murder as a business. Most of all, he doesn't like how Albert is respected more than him. Tensions simmer. Words are exchanged. And Albert, for the first time in years, feels a flicker of something close to insult. Because make no mistake, Albert doesn't crave power. He doesn't even seem to enjoy it. But disrespect, that's different. That has consequences. The year is 1941. Tension coils like a wire beneath the polished veneer of New York's underworld. Albert Anastasia, long the silent enforcer, now finds himself locked in a slow, creeping war of posture and suspicion with Vincent Mangano, the man technically above him in the family hierarchy, but increasingly irrelevant with every glance Albert receives from the commission, and every nod of approval from powerful friends like Luciano. Mangano was once a necessary fixture, a traditionalist, a believer in the rituals of the old mafia, the omertà in its most theatrical form, the Sicilian customs, the codes spoken only in dialect. But Albert? He's the opposite. Practical, cold, efficient. To him, traditions are nice stories. Power is measured in whispers, not weddings. The problem is, men like Mangano don't retire gracefully. They cling, dig their heels into the past, and mistake fear for control. It's a dangerous confusion. Albert begins moving differently. He starts bypassing Mangano on minor decisions, speaking directly with other families, particularly the up-and-comers, the Gambinos, the Genoveses, even the Chicago outfit. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't threaten. He just omits. It's the kind of silence that means more than an argument ever could. Then come the disappearances. In early 1951, Philip Mangano, Vincent's brother and consigliere, is found face down in a marsh near Jamaica Bay. 2 bullets in the head, suit soaked, wallet untouched. No one claims responsibility. A few hours later, Vincent himself simply vanishes. His car is found parked neatly in Brooklyn, keys in the ignition, a half-finished cigarette in the ashtray. Albert, when questioned, says only, "I was at the club." That's it. No elaboration, no flinch, no follow-up. And just like that, the Mangano reign ends, not with a shootout or a coup, but with a shrug. Many people still think that Albert didn't just orchestrate the hits. He executed one or both himself. They point to the precision, the absence of spectacle, the clean removal of obstacles without so much as a rumor beforehand. And truly, if ever there was a signature hit, this was it. The commission meets in hushed tones. They pretend to debate succession, but everyone already knows. Within days, Albert assumes command of what will soon be known as the Anastasia family. He doesn't throw a party. He doesn't announce it. He just shows up at the next meeting, sits in the chair once reserved for Mangano, and begins reading the numbers aloud like he's done it forever. His first order of business? Streamlining. He tightens extortion routes, dissolves inefficient rackets, and doubles down on the waterfront. Longshoremen unions, truck routes, import-export scams. If it touches the docks, Albert owns a slice, or more accurately, a silence. Because the beauty of his reign is not in how loudly he controls, it's in how quietly he doesn't have to. One story from 1952 illustrates this perfectly. A young union organizer from Hoboken starts asking questions, wants to clean up the docks, make things fairer for workers. A few days later, his mother receives a delivery, a box of polished shoes. Inside one is a single nail. No name, no note, just the implication. The man moves to Chicago the following week. Even federal investigators take note. A memo from that same year states, "The docks remain under the tight grip of the Anastasia faction. Attempts to penetrate have failed. Informants refuse to speak, citing fear of disappearance." But Albert's not content with just unions. He begins investing in more sophisticated operations, construction bids, international shipping, even Hollywood union connections. He's building something beyond a gang. He's building a machine. One that doesn't squeak. One that runs so smoothly, it almost disappears. And yet, for all this power, he never lets go of his roots. The knife still lives in his coat. The silence still sharpens behind his eyes. Every so often, someone steps out of line, takes a cut they weren't owed, opens their mouth too wide, forgets who watches from the corner booth. Those people vanish. Some are found days later, washed up and waterlogged. Others simply aren't. There's a famous unsolved case from 1953 involving a minor bookmaker named Tony Bellarosa, who tried to skim off the top of the family's numbers operation. He's last seen arguing with a man in a blue overcoat outside a Manhattan cafe. Surveillance later confirms that Albert wore a blue overcoat that day. Bellarosa's apartment is found untouched, his dog fed, mail uncollected. No forced entry, just absence. Even decades later, homicide detectives still refer to it as the Anastasia vanish. Still, not everyone is afraid. In fact, some are emboldened by Albert's precision. Frank Costello, the diplomatic don, sees in Albert a tool, but also a risk. He dislikes Albert's temperament, the quickness to silence. "It's bad for business," Costello reportedly says over dinner once. "You don't invest in something you can't predict." Albert doesn't care. He doesn't need to be predictable. He needs to be obeyed. The tension between Costello and Albert begins to grow. It's not overt. No shouting matches or shootouts. Just a rising tide of distrust. Costello begins subtly backing another rising star, Vito Genovese, a man equally cunning but far more restrained. a man who sees in Albert not a peer but a liability. Meanwhile, Albert's public image begins to shift. The press starts calling him the Mad Hatter. It's not just the brutal efficiency of his rule, it's the contrast, the soft voice, the perfect suits, the faint cologne. He doesn't look like a killer, which somehow makes it worse. In one photograph from 1954, Albert is seen attending a charity boxing match in Manhattan. He's in the front row, laughing, cigar unlit in hand, children nearby. The image circulates. Editors love the contrast. Executioner enjoys weekend. The caption reads, "What that photo doesn't show is the meeting that happens 3 hours later in a back room 2 blocks away, where a man tied to a failed heroin shipment leaves with 2 fewer fingers and a new understanding of how mistakes are treated." This duality becomes Albert's hallmark: public polish, private precision, polite to strangers, ruthless to betrayal. And still, his power grows. In 1955, he secures an audience with Meyer Lansky, who's been overseeing syndicate interests in Havana and Las Vegas. They discuss casino skimming, labor rackets, and silent investment structures. Albert listens more than he speaks. But when he does speak, it's direct. No metaphors. Just questions with expected answers. He leaves the meeting with a quiet agreement, a percentage in 2 Havana hotels, and a liaison contact in Florida. It's the first time Albert steps outside the New York syndicate's immediate reach. It won't be the last, but every empire casts a shadow. Whispers begin to swirl. Some say Albert is becoming too independent, too visible. Others hint that his reign is too personal, too bloody, too outdated. The Mafia Commission, increasingly shaped by Genovese's influence, begins to murmur. Even Carlo Gambino, Albert's own underboss and longtime ally, starts weighing silence over loyalty, because in the world of men like these, loyalty is currency. But timing is everything, and the clock on Albert Anastasia is starting to tick. By early 1956, Albert Anastasia stands like a granite pillar in a storm, a monument to an older brand of fear that doesn't sway in the wind. He's reached a peak most men only dare imagine: absolute authority over one of New York's 5 families, silent control over the docks, quiet stakes in Havana's glitz and Vegas's neon. And yet, there's a hum in the air, a subtle, constant vibration of unease, the kind of stillness just before a glass shatters. On the surface, Albert continues as always. He arrives at his favorite social club on 14th Street, wearing finely pressed suits with lapels so sharp they could draw blood. He tips his hat to doormen. He still holds his cigar like punctuation, letting it speak before he does. But beneath this polished surface, the chessboard is moving. Pieces are shifting, and not in his favor. The underworld's newer minds, Vito Genovese, Carlo Gambino, even the younger Gallo brothers, see a problem with Albert. He's unpredictable, too direct. He doesn't negotiate, he dictates. And in a world increasingly driven by quiet money and politics, Albert is starting to feel like a relic. Not useless, just dangerous. The final push begins with a subtle play. Frank Costello is nearly assassinated in May 1957, shot in the head by a lone gunman in the lobby of his apartment building. Miraculously, Costello survives. The bullet grazes his scalp, but the message lands. The man behind the trigger is Vincent the Chin Gigante. The man behind him? Most believe it's Vito Genovese. And what does Albert do? He visits Costello, sits by his bed, offers protection, but it's not enough. Costello sees the writing on the wall and steps back, ceding more power to Genovese to avoid becoming a permanent headline. Albert feels the walls tightening. And for the first time, he doesn't like the silence. That summer, the heat is stifling. New York sweats under the weight of humidity and unspoken intentions. Albert takes to spending long afternoons at the Park Sheraton Hotel, particularly its barbershop. It's one of the few places he can relax, a clean, white-tiled sanctuary where the chairs recline smoothly and the barbers know not to ask questions. He's not hiding. Not exactly. But he is slowing, perhaps even sensing. After all, he's not a fool. He knows how this world works. He's written part of its rule book. And deep down, he understands the math. The longer you sit on the throne, the more eyes count your heartbeats. Still, he doesn't step down. There's an FBI memo dated July 1957 describing Albert as increasingly isolated from the new wave of syndicate leaders. It notes that he's made fewer public appearances, that his movements are less routine and more cautious. The memo closes with an eerie line. Subject appears aware of potential threat, yet remains stationary. The irony. Murder Inc. was designed to eliminate men just like him. Those too powerful, too loud, too independent. And now, the blade that once swung in his hands is being whetted for his own neck. Meanwhile, Carlo Gambino waits. You remember Gambino, the quiet underboss with the soft voice and softer gaze. He's been beside Albert for over a decade, smiling, nodding, learning. Some describe him as the perfect number two. But Gambino isn't interested in being second forever. He's patient, snake patient. And now, with Genovese behind him and Costello diminished, he sees a path. A silent, golden road paved with Albert's absence. So whispers become meetings, meetings become plans, and soon the quietest deal in mob history is struck. Remove Albert. Do it clean. Do it publicly even. Let the world know that even the executioner bleeds. But how do you kill a man who sees everything coming? That's where routine helps. You see, for all his unpredictability, Albert has habits. He visits the same hotel. He uses the same barber. He likes his shave just so. Hot towel, straight razor, quiet hum of clippers. It's a ritual, a pause in a life lived too fast. So they wait. The men chosen for the hit aren't household names. That's the point. No connections, no recognition. Just two clean suits, a getaway car, and a moment. But before we go there, let's linger on a peculiar night, one that came just before it all unraveled. It's late September 1957. Albert is pacing inside his home in Fort Lee, New Jersey. He's restless. The house is quiet. His wife is away visiting family. The radio hums softly, jazz floating through half-lit rooms. And Albert, normally composed, is agitated. He checks the windows, sits, stands, lights a cigar, then lets it burn out. He calls his driver and cancels the next day's appointments. He tells his maid not to wake him early. Then, at the last minute, he reverses everything. Forget it, he says. We stick to the plan. Many people still think that if he had stayed home that morning, history would have changed. That even legends like Albert Anastasia sometimes hear fate knocking, but choose not to answer. There's no proof he sensed anything. No diary entry, no note. Just a quiet tension that hung over him like humidity before a storm. And here's something else. An oddity few people mention. Albert had been growing his hair out. Not by much. Just enough to make his barber comment. Looks like you're staying a while, the man joked. Albert smiled, didn't reply. That was the last haircut he'd ever sit for. because soon he'll recline in that chair at the Park Sheraton. The hot towel will come, the razor will glint, the door will open, and two men in coats too heavy for the weather will step inside. It's the morning of October 25th, 1957. Manhattan wakes up under a hazy sky, its streets already humming with taxis, shoe shines, and cigarette smoke curling from sidewalk grates. At the Park Sheraton Hotel on 56th and 7th, the lobby buzzes with its usual mid-morning rhythm. Bellhops hauling bags, businessmen adjusting cufflinks, a few tourists pretending not to be lost. In the basement of the hotel sits a barbershop, polished tile floor, mirrors from wall to wall, the kind of place where everything smells faintly of aftershave and linoleum. The hum of clippers, the snip of scissors, and the muffled rhythm of Sinatra playing on a small radio tucked behind a shelf of pomades. Albert Anastasia arrives shortly before 10:15 a.m. He steps into the barbershop in a gray suit, coat over his arm, the same unlit cigar between his fingers. The same look, like he already owns the room and doesn't need to prove it. He nods to the barber, hands his coat over, and sinks into the second chair from the entrance. It's his usual chair. He likes the angle. One mirror to his left, another behind. The kind of setup where a man can see everything, but not today. The barber wraps the white sheet around him, tucks the collar, and prepares the towel. Outside, a car idles. Two men step out. They don't rush. They don't speak. Their hats are pulled low, coats buttoned up despite the mild weather. One carries a newspaper folded tight under his arm. Inside that newspaper, a .32 and a .38 revolver. This is not a robbery. This is not personal. This is history wearing gloves. Back inside, Albert leans back as the towel is removed. The barber picks up the clippers. There's a lull, just a moment. The radio crackles, then the door bursts open. The two men don't hesitate. They fire 7 rounds. 4 hit Albert in the face and chest. 2 miss. 1 ricochets into a mirror. The room explodes in chaos. Shards of glass screaming. The scent of gunpowder colliding with hair tonic. Albert stumbles forward, the white sheet still wrapped around him, stained now. He claws at the air, staggering toward the mirror, as if trying to find the source. One version says he even made it to his feet before collapsing again. By the time the shooting stops, the 2 men are already gone. The getaway car, an old Ford, disappears into midtown traffic. No one gets a plate. No one remembers the drivers. Just coats. Just hats. Just silence. Within minutes, the hotel is swarming. Police cordon off the basement. Reporters crowd the sidewalks. Flashbulbs pop. And on that pristine barbershop floor, amid a pool of blood and shattered glass, lies one of the most powerful men the American mafia has ever known. Dead, mid-haircut, no fanfare, just finality. That photo, grainy, black and white, showing a lifeless Albert slumped beneath a shattered mirror, becomes iconic. It graces the front page of nearly every newspaper in America. Executioner executed. The headlines scream, Murder Inc., founder slain in Midtown. Mainstream history never forgets that image. It becomes shorthand for mob justice, for irony, for the brutal cycle of power that swallows even its kings. But what happened in the moments after? The barber trembled as he described the shooting. He said he'd seen Albert's eyes widen just before the shots rang out, but there wasn't time to speak. He looked surprised, the man said later, but not scared. The autopsy confirms 5 bullet wounds, 2 fatal. The cigar was never lit. The newspaper that one shooter carried was later found in a trash can 3 blocks away, torn in half. And just like that, the Lord High Executioner is gone. Many people still think the commission ordered the hit unanimously. Others suggest it was Gambino's doing, perhaps with Genovese's blessing. Some even argue Meyer Lansky signed off on it, less out of malice, more to restore order. So what do you think? Was this justice for Mangano? For Costello? For the dozens, maybe hundreds, who disappeared under Albert's reign? Or was it something colder? The funeral is a modest affair. Closed casket. Fort Lee, New Jersey. Dozens attend. Hundreds do not. The fear lingers. No one wants to be next to the next target. Carlo Gambino delivers no eulogy, but he stands front row, hat removed, expression unreadable. Within weeks, Gambino assumes control of the family. The Anastasia name is erased, replaced by his own. He doesn't throw a coup. He doesn't hold a ceremony. He just is, like a tide that comes in slow and then never leaves. The barbershop reopens eventually. The mirror is replaced. The blood scrubbed away. But people avoid that second chair for months. Some say it felt colder. Others say the glass still shook when you sat down. Eventually, the shop closes altogether. Too many memories. Too much noise in a place that once promised silence. Meanwhile, federal agents sift through Albert's history. They find almost nothing. No personal ledgers. No damning recordings. Just whispers. The perfect criminal file. Thick with rumors. Thin on evidence. And yet, his absence leaves a mark. The docks don't run quite as tightly anymore. Fear loses its shape. Younger gangsters start testing limits. Power begins to fragment. The mob, as a whole, becomes less centralized, more corporate. The days of the solitary executioner making quiet decisions from the shadows, they're over. Albert Anastasia died at 55, not in war, not in exile, but in a barber's chair with foam still on his cheek. And that somehow feels exactly right. He lived by silence, by precision, and in the end, he died mid-sentence. Not because he lost, but because the world around him changed, and he didn't. Maybe that's the cost of control, of being the last man who still believed fear could keep the sea calm. He didn't scream, he didn't plead, he just fell. The city didn't slow for Albert Anastasia's death. New York kept moving, indifferent as ever. Taxis honking, steam rising, headlines fading by the next week. But inside the world he once ruled, something cracked. His assassination didn't just remove a man. It removed a certainty, a pillar of silent consequence. And in its absence, the balance shifted. Quietly, like a piano losing its anchor note, Carlo Gambino stepped forward with the subtlety of a man already in motion. He didn't make announcements. He didn't need to. His hands were already on the controls. Associates, capos, and union men who once shook when Anastasia cleared his throat now found their knees steady again. Gambino made things feel more stable, less personal, less lethal. Many people still think that Gambino had been waiting for this exact moment for years, that every smile he gave Albert was timed, every favor returned with quiet interest. Whether or not he personally ordered the hit, one thing is certain. He profited from it immediately. The Anastasia family became the Gambino family almost overnight. The books didn't change much. The money still flowed. But the atmosphere softened, at least on the surface. Gambino's style was more businesslike, less bloodthirsty. But don't mistake calm for kindness. He'd learned everything from Albert. He just applied it with a silkier touch. Meanwhile, law enforcement erupted with renewed purpose. They thought, perhaps naively, that Anastasia's murder would lead to infighting, betrayal, maybe even collapse. Instead, they got unity. Quiet, efficient reshuffling. No civil war, just one more name carved into the marble of mob history. Still, the FBI couldn't let it go. In the months that followed, agents reopened cold files tied to Murder Inc. They exhumed reports, traced money trails, dug into union records Albert had once treated like personal ledgers. But they found little, because Albert had been careful. No recordings, no journals, no confessions. Even the few men who had worked closely with him said the same thing. He didn't leave tracks, he left silence. A rare interview with a former Anastasia soldier, granted anonymously in the 70s, offered a strange reflection. He didn't just scare people, he settled them. When he walked into a room, you didn't worry anymore. Not because it was safe, but because you knew nothing stupid was going to happen. He was the last guy who made bad ideas disappear before they turned into bad headlines. That was Albert's brand of control. Preemptive. He didn't wait for chaos to unfold. He smothered it before it breathed. But after him, everything became a little louder. Within a year of his death, the commission convened privately to discuss the future. The topic wasn't Albert. It was the vacuum he left. The need to ensure no one else built a personal kingdom under the mob's roof. Rules tightened, territories redrawn. Murder Inc. was never officially revived. Too many ghosts. Yet Albert's fingerprints never fully faded. The training he gave, the methods, the quiet professionalism, echoed in younger enforcers. They just wore better suits now, drove quieter cars, killed with pens as often as bullets. There's an anecdote from 1959 that proves this eerie legacy. A young gangster in Miami tried to emulate Albert's style. Same suit cuts, same demeanor, even carried an unlit cigar. Problem was, he didn't have Albert's restraint. He got involved in a messy nightclub dispute, shot a man in front of 20 witnesses, and bragged about it to a journalist. The commission had him removed within 48 hours. No headlines, no spectacle, just gone. And the reason, whispered later, "You're not Albert." Because Albert didn't boast. Albert didn't leave witnesses. Albert didn't treat murder like fashion. For him, it had purpose. Clean lines, rules. That's the part modern movies always miss. They paint him as a maniac, a butcher with a temper. But that wasn't the man those closest to him knew. To them, he was less storm, more glacier. Slow-moving, massive, cold, and impossible to stop once he had momentum. Even his home life reflected that paradox. His children were raised away from the business. His wife, Elsa, rarely attended social events. They lived in Fort Lee in a modest house. Not poor, but not extravagant. Albert, for all his power, avoided gold watches and showy cars. He wasn't built for spectacle. One neighbor remembered him fondly. He was quiet, didn't bother no one, said good morning every day, helped carry groceries once. You wouldn't believe who he was if you just saw him with the mail, and maybe that's the point. He didn't want to be seen. He wanted to exist, in shadows, in margins, in places where names didn't stick. The more invisible he became, the more effective he was, until the barbershop, because that day, for just a moment, he let himself believe he could relax, that he could recline in a chair, face up to the world, and not get punished for it. Many people still debate whether he knew, whether some final instinct had flared just before the door opened, whether he'd sensed the weight in the air, the pause in the radio static, the slight creak that wasn't the barber's shoes. So what do you think? Can a man like that ever truly be caught by surprise? Or did he, just once, choose to look away? The truth is, we'll never know. His story ends not with explanation, but with absence. No last words, no retribution, no trial. Just a pool of blood on white tile, and a city that shrugged and moved on. But his legend? That lingered. In photographs, in FBI files, in the reluctant awe of men who walked behind him, and in the cold silence of second barbershop chairs across America, forever a little colder than the rest. After Albert Anastasia's death, the air inside the criminal underworld felt different. Not louder, not quieter, but cautious. Like a room where someone important just walked out, and no one quite knows who's in charge of the mood anymore. For over 2 decades, Albert had been the man others turned to when things got messy, when a body needed to disappear, when a message needed to be felt more than heard. Now, that certainty was gone, and the vacuum left behind had a shape, a chill, a discipline that no one could quite replicate. Carlo Gambino wasted no time consolidating the newly christened Gambino family. He swept up the remains of Albert's empire with a bureaucrat's finesse. The books were balanced. The capos were shifted. Anyone too loyal to Albert was either transferred to a quieter corner or simply removed. Not violently, mind you. Gambino was no brute. He preferred reassignment through irrelevance, but Albert's ghost still hung in the halls. Every man who walked the docks, every enforcer who remembered the old days, felt it. The rules hadn't changed, but the tone had. There were fewer whispered threats, fewer sharp glances that made hearts stutter. Instead, the mob entered an era of gentle nods, quiet books, and less blood. It was still dangerous, but in a more corporate way, and yet, for the FBI, this shift felt like an opportunity. With Albert gone, they believed the machine might now show its screws. Agents doubled down on surveillance, wiretaps, and informant pressure. A memo from December 1957 reads, "With the executioner removed, lower-tier operatives appear more vocal, suggest intensified infiltration." What they didn't realize was that the fear Albert instilled had planted itself so deeply, it lingered long after the man was buried. Even those who'd never met him told stories as if they had. There's a tale from 1958, barely a year after the barbershop slaying, of a mid-level associate named Mikey "Two-Time" Russo. He was young, loud, eager to climb. One night, drunk in a Brooklyn bar, he referred to Albert as the old butcher with a shaving fetish. The room fell silent. Not because anyone believed Albert would come walking through the door, but because mocking the dead man still felt risky. Mikey didn't disappear, but he never got another promotion. Gambino made sure of that, not as punishment, but as preservation. You don't poison the memory of a man whose silence held a city together. Many people still think that Gambino admired Albert more than he ever admitted, that he didn't just learn from him, he modeled himself on him. The stillness, the underestimation, the calculated softness. It was Albert's legacy in new clothing. Meanwhile, in public memory, Albert took on an almost cinematic quality. He became larger than the headlines, sharper than the myths. Books speculated, movies loosely adapted. His name slipped into pop culture shorthand. Anastasia wasn't just a man, it became a mood. Cold, controlled, unflinching. But as with all mythologized men, the details began to blur. Historians disagreed on his exact body count. Some claimed over 80 confirmed kills. Others said that number was inflated, because when you're that feared, everyone wants to blame you. Still, there was no denying the fear he instilled had a precise gravity. Entire investigations stalled simply because witnesses vanished or recanted. One agent reportedly said, You can't indict a ghost. What made him so effective? It wasn't charisma. Albert wasn't a performer. He didn't speak in riddles or offer dramatic monologues like some of his peers. He was polite, flat-toned, always listening, and that's what unnerved people. He wasn't unpredictable in the explosive way. He was predictable in the inevitable way. Once you crossed a line, you knew how it ended. The only mystery was when. There's an image that comes from an old dockworker's account of Albert leaning against a crate on the Brooklyn waterfront, staring out at the Hudson with his sleeves rolled up and a knife still clipped to his belt. The man said he never forgot the way Albert looked. Not angry, not plotting, just still, like a machine waiting for input. That's how he ran Murder, Inc., not as a spree, but as a schedule. He didn't enjoy killing. He saw it as necessary maintenance, a correction, something broken that had to be made clean again. A cog too sharp, a wire fraying, a knot that wouldn't untangle. And yet, even in his coldness, there was structure. He believed in hierarchy, in punishment proportional to error, in never killing for free. One informant said, Albert wouldn't kill you for stealing. He'd warn you first. But if you lied, that's what he couldn't stand. Lies wasted time. So what do you think? Can a man who killed so many still be considered disciplined? Can there be a code inside the chaos? The debate continues among scholars and criminal historians. Some argue he was nothing but a thug with a press agent. Others call him a necessary evil in a world where negotiation sometimes fails. A few even say he was the last of the honest enforcers, a man who did exactly what he said he would, no more, no less. Whatever the truth, Albert's absence marked the end of an era. The mob would go on to evolve. Wiretaps would bring down bosses, new laws would shatter unions, and young upstarts would favor cocaine over codes. But none of them would ever recreate the atmosphere of those Murder, Inc. years. The weight of that silence. The way a room changed when one man with a cigar walked in. Because here's the thing about Albert. He didn't need to speak. He was the sentence. By the 1960s, the world that Albert Anastasia once ruled had been repainted in shades of beige. The jazz clubs gave way to diners. The alleyway meetings were replaced with phone taps and subpoenas, and even the term mafia had taken on a more cinematic sheen than street-level terror. The mob still operated, yes, but it had been scrubbed, shaved, rebranded. Everything Albert was not, and yet his name refused to vanish. Every time a new mob trial made headlines, Albert's shadow was there. Not directly. He had no heirs, no legacy operation. But his style, his philosophy, his blueprint of fear lingered like smoke in old union halls and behind the eyes of men who once served him. There's a peculiar way mob legends endure, not by being retold loudly, but by being felt quietly. A gesture, a pause before a name is spoken, a silence around certain stories. Albert's closest allies, the few who survived into old age, never said much about him. But when they did, the tone always changed. Anastasia, one retired associate once said during a sealed deposition. He wasn't like the others. He didn't need applause. It's an odd sentiment in a world built on ego. But that's what made Albert unique. He didn't feed on admiration. He fed on efficiency, on the system working, on fear doing its job so thoroughly that no action was needed at all. That's why his death left such a vacuum. It wasn't just a powerful man being removed. It was the removal of certainty. After him, there were bosses. There were killers. But there were no more executioners in the capital E sense. No one else quite embodied consequence like he did. Many people still think that Murder Inc. wasn't just a gang. It was an idea, a protocol, and Albert was its cold nerve center. He didn't just lead it, he was it. And once he was gone, no one dared reboot it. Not because they couldn't, but because they understood it was a one-man system. That's what frightened even the bravest of men. The idea that one person could remove you without rage, without mess, without needing to be in the same room. Just a nod, a whisper, a date that was suddenly missing from your calendar. There's a case from 1961, an unsolved murder of a former Union delegate turned real estate investor. The man had reportedly started discussing old waterfront payouts tied to the Anastasia era. Weeks later, he's found in his garage, the engine running, no signs of struggle. Official cause, suicide, but his friends say otherwise. They say he'd received a letter. No return address. Just a folded newspaper clipping of Albert's barbershop slaying, and a single word typed on the back. Quiet. The FBI never traced it. Perhaps it was a coincidence. Or perhaps, more chillingly, it was someone preserving Albert's legacy. Not out of duty, but out of belief. And belief, that's a funny thing. Because while facts fade, belief lingers. It shapes reputations, even in death. Albert's funeral, as quiet as it was, remains the subject of speculation. Closed casket, Fort Lee Cemetery. Rain that day. A few dozen attendees, mostly family, a few former associates. Gambino, of course, present but unreadable. But there's one peculiar note from that day. A single black car parked across the street from the cemetery, windows tinted, engine running. It never moved, never idled, just sat. No one ever stepped out. No one admitted to driving it. Some believe it was a federal tale. Others believe it was one last goodbye from someone who couldn't be seen at the gravesite. Or maybe it was just a car. So what do you think? Is a man's legend written by his acts, or by the space he leaves behind? One of the more philosophical agents on the FBI's task force once wrote in his notebook, Anastasia was gravity. You didn't see him, you just felt pulled by him. And if you tried to escape, well, you'd end up floating in the East River. Poetic perhaps, but apt, because even now, decades later, there are spots in New York where his name still opens doors, or slams them shut. Old clubhouses where bartenders lower their voices when you ask about him. Docks where longshoremen remember the days when the union rep's phone ringing at midnight meant you were either fired or something worse. And in every mob documentary, every true crime series, there's a moment when the tone dips, the music softens, and someone mentions Albert Anastasia, not as a colorful gangster, not as a side character, but as a turning point, a hinge in the history of organized crime, a man who defined an age without ever needing to define himself. You see, most mobsters end up one of three ways: flashy and dead, forgotten and free, or locked away spinning tales of the old days. Albert? He was none of those. He was a conclusion, a sentence you didn't want to end, a silence that didn't need filling. In the years following Albert Anastasia's assassination, organized crime in America began its slow, calculated metamorphosis. No longer fueled by the sheer intimidation of one man's presence, it adapted into something quieter, more complex, and in many ways, harder to see. Rackets that once relied on muscle turned to paperwork. Payoffs turned into lobbying. And yet, within all that change, the lessons Albert left behind remained etched in the bones of every family. It's 1963 when the mob's first major public reckoning arrives, the Valachi hearings. The moment the American public hears the term Cosa Nostra for the first time on national television. Joseph Valachi, small-time soldier, never a big name, sits under hot lights and spills more than anyone expects. And he says Albert's name more than once. He calls him the executioner, the butcher, the man you hoped never knew your name. He describes stories that sound almost mythological, how Albert never raised his voice, never repeated himself, how he once nodded at a man from across a room, and that man left the country the next day without packing. Of course, the committee eats it up. The papers do too. America, suddenly fascinated, needs a face to attach to the darkness now entering their living rooms. And even in death, Albert Anastasia obliges. The hearings turn him into something bigger than he was. They round off the rough edges, skip the nuance, magnify the brutality. He becomes a symbol, the boogeyman of Brooklyn, the face of Murder, Inc. Even if Murder, Inc. hadn't existed for years before his death, many people still think that this mythologizing was deliberate, that Valachi, in painting Albert as the darkest figure in the room, made his own crimes seem smaller, more forgivable. I was bad, he implies, but I wasn't him. But if that's the case, the plan backfired. Because the more people heard about Albert, the more they were intrigued. Journalists began digging, writers began scripting, and suddenly stories started resurfacing. Half-remembered legends from retired detectives, blurred photographs found in basement archives, old associates whose memories were conveniently more detailed now that the man himself was buried. And like all legends, the further away Albert got, the larger he loomed. There's an interesting moment in 1970, a quiet nod to Albert from the man who replaced him. Gambino, now the Don of Dons, sits for a rare meeting with a few trusted lieutenants in a Long Island country club. They're discussing a problem. Someone noisy in Atlantic City, shaking too many cages. One of the younger men suggests a warning shot. Maybe rough the guy up. Gambino, usually mild, interrupts. If Albert was still here, he says, we wouldn't be talking, we'd be toasting. No one replies. They just nod, because they know what he means. Albert didn't believe in second chances for stupidity. To him, chaos wasn't an inconvenience, it was treason. That's part of what made him terrifying. You didn't need to be evil to be in his sights. You just had to be inefficient. Efficiency, that was the real key. You hear it in the way his old crew still talk, at least the few who did survive long enough to talk. One said, he hated mess, hated talking twice. If you needed a reminder, you got replaced, not yelled at, not punished, just replaced. It's not the romantic image of the gangster we see on screen, is it? No jokes, no charm, just consequence. And in that cold philosophy, Albert stood apart, even from men like Lucky Luciano, who had vision, or Meyer Lansky, who had math, or Genovese, who had ambition. Albert had execution. He made things end. That's why the FBI, to this day, refers to him in certain internal training documents. Not because he was the most prolific, not even because he was the most powerful, but because he represented a kind of danger that can't be caught on tape, the kind that leaves no evidence, just silence. There's a file, archived now but once circulated between regional offices, titled Anastasia Protocols. It outlines how to handle a suspect or enforcer that operates in the Anastasia style. That is, no trail, no phone calls, no bluster. Just clean hits, tight timing, and absolute unpredictability. The final line of that memo is simple. If he doesn't brag, be afraid. Even now, that silence resonates. Old-timers at certain Brooklyn cafes still lower their voices when discussing the Lord High Executioner, not out of superstition, but out of respect. Or maybe habit. Because when someone ruled that completely for that long, their presence lingers in muscle memory. In 1975, a new barbershop opens not far from the Park Sheraton site. It's sleek, modern, full of mirrors and gold trim. One of the chairs, coincidentally or not, is set against a mirror with a fine crack running through it. It becomes a running joke. Albert's seat, the staff calls it. Few customers request it. Some refuse to sit there outright, because there are memories that echo louder than footsteps. And Albert Anastasia? He doesn't walk anymore. But in rooms like that, you can almost feel him watching. So, what do you think? Do legends die in barbershops? Or do they just wait? Quiet, razor in hand, for someone to forget what they once meant. It's hard to say exactly when Albert Anastasia slipped fully into the realm of folklore. Maybe it was the day the last known member of Murder Inc. passed away in silence. Maybe it was the moment mob families stopped enforcing discipline with knives and began relying more on accountants and lawyers. Or maybe it was when Hollywood got hold of his legend and polished it until it shined just enough to sell popcorn. Because eventually, all powerful men become stories. And Albert? His story was told in whispers before it ever hit the page. By the mid-1970s, organized crime is a different beast. The suits are sharper, the language is cleaner, and the guns, though still used, come out less often. It's the age of wiretaps, not ambushes. The underworld begins to worry less about who's got the toughest enforcer and more about who knows someone at City Hall. Still, his name lingers. One evening in 1976, an FBI agent sits across from a newly flipped informant, an aging bookmaker who's finally chosen survival over silence. They talk names, timelines, payoffs. Everything's laid out like a map. But then the agent asks, offhandedly, "What about Anastasia?" The bookmaker pauses, looks down, fidgets with his sleeve. "He made the air feel different," he says. It's a strange thing to say about a man, but not strange for Albert. Because what he left behind wasn't just a reputation, it was atmosphere. He changed the temperature of a room, and yet, for all his infamy, there are almost no first-hand documents written by Albert himself. No letters, no diary, no recorded speeches. Even Luciano, Lansky, Genovese, each of them left behind scraps, quotes, some hint of their inner monologue. But Albert, nothing. Many people still think this was intentional, that he treated even thoughts like evidence, that his legacy was designed to live not in words, but in reactions, in the way people changed posture when his name entered the room. The men who came after him tried to mimic the myth, but they always overdid it. Too much flair, too much violence. They wanted the fear, but forgot the economy of gesture Albert mastered. He didn't wave threats around like a flag. He folded them neatly and slid them across the table. And maybe that's why, in film and fiction, he's been reimagined so many times, sometimes clearly, sometimes faintly disguised. The cold consigliere, the quiet assassin, the smiling butcher, the character who never needs to yell because everyone already knows what happens if he does. But real Albert, he wasn't smiling. He wasn't poetic. He wasn't even complex. He was decisive. There's a report from an NYPD detective dated 1955, 2 years before Albert's death. It describes a meeting between Anastasia and a minor capo who'd bungled a protection racket. The capo arrived late, stammered his excuses, waited for punishment. Albert looked at him once and said, "Fix it, that's all." And the capo did. No threats, no punishment, just the weight of expectation. Because under Albert, error didn't need scolding. It corrected itself, or ceased existing. Still, as time moved on, and the mob began to rot from within. Drugs, FBI moles, RICO indictments. His name slowly became a kind of shorthand for before. Before everything got complicated. Before deals were negotiated in courtrooms instead of clubs. Before fear had to be explained. One journalist writing in 1980 reflected on this strange nostalgia. Anastasia belonged to an age of gangsters who were terrifying, yes, but also efficient. If a man was killed, it wasn't a headline. It was a decision. It's an odd kind of reverence. Admiration tangled with fear. The way you might remember a brutal teacher who somehow taught you more in silence than others did with textbooks. So what do you think? Can legacy survive in stillness? Because Albert's story isn't written in victories or possessions. He didn't own empires the way Capone did. He didn't build political networks like Lansky. What he built was trust. A terrible, irreversible kind of trust. If Albert said a man wouldn't bother you again, he didn't. And perhaps that's why his end felt so sharp, so jarring. Because for decades, he was the blade. Then, in one morning, he became the target. One more example of how, in his world, peace was never a promise, just a temporary arrangement. But his ghost, it never agreed to leave. There's an old apartment in Red Hook, brick walls, creaky stairs, a corner unit overlooking the docks. They say Albert visited it once, just once, a meeting with a local crew boss. No violence, no argument, just a conversation. After that, the crew boss never stepped out of line again. That apartment's still there. The stairs still creak. But every tenant who's moved into that unit since has reported the same thing. A chill that won't leave. Even in summer. Even with the windows open. Folklore, maybe. Or maybe Albert left a little of himself behind. Just enough to remind the walls what silence can do. By the 1980s, organized crime in America had lost much of its romantic illusion. Federal prosecutors had adapted. Surveillance had evolved. And those who once operated in smoke-filled backrooms now found themselves testifying under fluorescent lights in federal courtrooms, sweating in suits that no longer carried power, only memories. But Albert Anastasia, he remained untouched. Not in body, of course, but in legacy. He'd been gone for over 2 decades, yet in whispered conversations among older mobsters, his name still hung like the smell of aftershave long after the man wearing it had left the room. He wasn't brought up casually, and he was never mocked. Even the most brazen criminals, those who laughed about bloodshed, who called judges by nicknames, would lower their voices when referencing the executioner. There's a moment captured in an FBI wiretap from 1983. 2 soldiers from the Genovese family sit at a diner, sipping coffee, discussing a messy hit that went wrong. Sloppy, public, loud. One mutters, "Anastasia wouldn't have let it go that way." The other just nods. No rebuttal. Because what's there to say? Albert had become a benchmark, not a man, a measurement. Efficiency was judged by what he might have done. Control was imagined in his stillness. The quietest room always won the comparison. And in the underworld, where power is measured not in noise, but in absence, Albert still ruled. Many people still think that Albert's greatest strength wasn't his ruthlessness, but his ability to predict when to strike, and more importantly, when not to. He didn't act out of impulse. He acted from blueprint. There's a recovered FBI file, partially redacted, that details an anonymous tip in 1956. A rival crew in Newark had reportedly insulted the Anastasia family by attempting to undercut a waterfront deal. The Bureau expected retaliation. Weeks passed. Nothing happened. Then, on the last day of the month, A single truckload of cargo from the Newark docks disappeared. Not the whole shipment, just one truck. Inside, 50 crates of imported leather, uncut, untraceable, high value. No violence, no confrontation, message received. And that was Albert's style. Blood wasn't always necessary, but if it was used cleanly. He didn't posture, he proved. The contrast becomes especially stark as the mob of the 80s and 90s spirals into chaos. Flashy dons like John Gotti wear $3,000 suits and court the spotlight. They dine at celebrity restaurants, give quotes to reporters, laugh in the face of the law. Albert would have been horrified, not because he feared exposure, but because he hated waste. And nothing, in his mind, was more wasteful than vanity. Attention was an invitation to scrutiny, and scrutiny led to sloppiness. Sloppiness led to death. That's the irony of the mob's evolution. The generation after Albert sought fame, and in doing so, they ensured their own downfall. The FBI didn't beat them with bullets. It beat them with microphones, cameras, and public interest. So what do you think? Was Albert the villain history paints him to be? Or was he simply a necessary instrument? A sharp one, yes, but wielded with precision in a world where chaos needed cutting. The scholarly debate continues. Criminologists, historians, even psychologists have analyzed the paradox of the man. How someone so feared could be so restrained. How a figure tied to so many deaths could live by a code others failed to match. And there's another curious note. Despite his reputation, Albert had almost no public outbursts, no famous tirades, no drunken scandals, no tabloid affairs. He was, to many outside the life, boring. Just a quiet businessman from New Jersey who liked his routines and didn't say much. That's why his funeral surprised people, not because of who attended, but because of who didn't. Most of the mob stayed away. Out of fear, respect, both. Only Elsa, his wife, and a few close relatives stood at his graveside as the priest muttered Latin over the casket. The day was overcast. A light mist fell. Not quite rain, but just enough to make everything seem distant. A few days later, someone left a single cigar on his grave. Not lit, not bitten, just resting there, like punctuation at the end of a sentence. No one claimed responsibility, but old habits die hard. And for those who remembered, it wasn't a tribute, it was a reminder. You don't forget men like Albert Anastasia. You forget around them. In the criminal ecosystem of mid-20th century America, Albert Anastasia functioned like a natural force. Not a storm. Storms are loud, unpredictable, and leave debris in every direction. No, Albert was more like erosion. Steady, controlled, and capable of reshaping entire landscapes without needing to raise his voice. As the years passed, his name remained oddly consistent. He wasn't reinvented like other mob figures, constantly reinterpreted through pop culture filters. Instead, he stayed still in the public mind. A single image, hard eyes, unlit cigar, clean suit, and silence you could choke on. And silence, as it turned out, aged better than noise. In 1985, the commission trial brought the American mafia to its knees. Bosses were convicted. Organizations buckled under the weight of RICO statutes. Informants piled up. The illusion of the untouchable criminal family began to unravel on national television, and through all of it, Albert's name surfaced again. Not because he was involved, obviously. He'd been dead for nearly 30 years. But because as the prosecutions tore through family hierarchies, federal prosecutors referenced the old ways as a contrast. The days of tight-lipped enforcement, of hits without headlines, Of men who didn't need to be reminded of the rules, Anastasia became the example of what used to work, what kept everything, however brutal, orderly. And maybe that was the strange elegance of his method. He didn't aim for peace. He aimed for control. And for a while, they were the same thing. There's a declassified FBI transcript from that era, an undercover recording of a Gambino capo reminiscing about the old days. With Albert, things got done. No drama. You crossed a line, you got handled. No speeches, no trials, just done. Guys now, they talk too much. Think they're in a movie. And that's the core of it. Albert never performed. He never sought narrative. He was the conclusion, not the plot. Yet even he couldn't rewrite the ending. So what do you think? Can order survive the man who enforced it? Because after his death, the rules didn't disappear, but the discipline did. Gambino maintained a strong grip, yes, but he had to manage people. Albert, he didn't manage. He didn't negotiate. He created parameters so clear that stepping outside of them meant vanishing. That level of precision is rare, even in criminal circles. It's often overlooked that Albert didn't just eliminate threats. He also prevented them. There's an old trick he used, reportedly, with soldiers who grew too ambitious. Praise. He'd publicly compliment them at meetings, call them too important for street business, elevate them, and in doing so, he cut off their access to action. They became visible, they became still, and slowly, they faded. It's power by redirection, a kind of chess no one expected from a man so often mistaken for a blade. Many people still think of him only as the face of Murder, Inc., the muscle, the butcher. But that's a misread. Albert had no patience for chaos. He didn't kill for satisfaction. He killed for silence, and silence for him was the currency of power, which is why the details of his personal life remain so frustratingly sparse. He had children, 2, perhaps 3, depending on the source. A quiet home in Fort Lee, a garden he rarely tended but enjoyed sitting beside, no grand cars, no lavish vacations. He kept his wealth liquid, his preferences modest, and his schedule tight. There's a photograph from 1955. One of the last taken before his death. Albert stands at the edge of a dock in New Jersey, coat collar raised against the wind, cigar in hand. The river behind him is still. His face is turned away from the camera. And yet, even from behind, the image speaks. It says, "Here is a man who knew what the water could swallow." Scholars argue over how to classify Albert. Some label him a sociopath. Others say he was a product of violent times. A few suggest he was a necessary evil in a world that valued loyalty above all else. But the truth, whatever it is, lies somewhere in the tension between his silence and his impact. The silence that made men confess things they hadn't done, just to avoid being noticed. The silence that kept judges cautious, neighbors polite, and prosecutors careful with their wording, because Albert didn't need a voice to be heard. He had timing, he had reputation, he had absence, and absence, when shaped correctly, becomes a kind of presence all its own. That's why, even now, his legend endures. In barbershops with broken mirrors, in union halls with framed photographs no one will admit to hanging, in books that try to decode him and fail, because he was never meant to be decoded. He was meant to be obeyed. As the 1990s dawned, the mob faced an identity crisis. The old guard was gone, either dead, flipped, or locked away in federal penitentiaries that stretched from Leavenworth to Lewisburg. The new recruits came from television, not the streets. They mimicked Pacino and De Niro, not Mangano and Luciano. And in that drift from real to role play, something essential was lost. Albert Anastasia would have hated it. By that point, his name had been carved into lore so deeply It no longer required updates. He didn't need a movie. He was the line between what the mob once was and what it would never be again. A man remembered not just for what he did, but for the fear of what he might have done had he lived, because many people still think that if Albert had survived the barbershop, the entire face of American organized crime might have been different. That he could have resisted the celebrity fever that infected the younger dons. That he would have kept the family tight, the bloodshed quiet, the ambition chained. But history doesn't entertain hypotheticals for long. Still, the speculation persisted. Even in law enforcement, one retired FBI agent, interviewed in a 1994 documentary, remarked, "If Anastasia had lasted another 5 years, we'd have needed a different playbook. The one we used on Gotti? It wouldn't have worked on him. He didn't talk. He didn't show off. You can't wiretap a man who already said everything with a look. That's what made Albert different." His power didn't rely on volume. It didn't rely on visibility. It relied on consistency. Something increasingly rare in a world chasing faster highs and louder threats. In the mid-90s, a young associate in the Bonanno family made headlines for orchestrating a flashy drive-by shooting. Cameras caught the aftermath. News anchors gasped. Politicians fumed. And back in Brooklyn, in a private meeting room above a bakery, an old consigliere shook his head and muttered, "Anastasia would have fed that kid his own trigger finger, not as a punishment, as a lesson." That's how his memory was used. Not to glorify, but to warn. Because Albert didn't tolerate mess. He didn't tolerate spectacle. And above all, he didn't tolerate repeat mistakes. So, what do you think? Can a man become immortal by making the world less chaotic, one decision at a time? It's an odd form of legacy. Not one of monuments or memoirs, but one of protocol. To this day, some of the mob's oldest practices still trace back to his reign. Silent eliminations, tightly controlled crews, the sacred separation between personal emotions and business decisions. That's perhaps the greatest irony. Albert Anastasia, widely known as the most violent of his era, was, in many ways, its most disciplined. His rules were blood-soaked, yes, but they were clear. And clarity, in the world of organized crime, is rarer than loyalty. Take the docks, for example. Even long after his death, the unions he once controlled still operated under codes he helped instill. Jobs were assigned based on order, not favoritism. Kickbacks were collected at fixed rates. Troublesome men disappeared only when necessary, and always quietly. You didn't have to like the system, you just had to respect it. And that's what he left behind. A template. One that didn't require his presence to function. One that outlasted every man who tried to claim it as their own. There's a stretch of waterfront in Red Hook, largely abandoned now, where the ghost of that system still lingers. Crumbling warehouses, faded chalk markings on the walls, bent hooks hanging from rusted beams. The whispers say this was one of Albert's favorite spots, a quiet dock where meetings happened at midnight, under the groan of distant ships and the crackle of cigarette ash on cold concrete. It's still there, no historical marker, no plaque, just space, air, and the feeling that if you stood there too long, someone would ask what you were doing. Not loudly, not with words, just with presence, because that was always the point. Albert didn't need to be seen to be known. He just needed you to know he could be. That's why the barbershop hit was so jarring. It wasn't just the murder, it was the method. Public, messy. It felt like a violation of his own rulebook, and many believe that was intentional. A statement, a message to anyone else who thought they were too important to be touched. But the fallout was paradoxical. It made him more powerful in death than he had been in life. His murder didn't erase him. It crystallized him, turned him into a fixed point in mob mythology, the moment when discipline died, and chaos began to dress itself in gold chains and designer suits. So no, he didn't live to see the downfall, but he doesn't have to. His absence is still felt every time someone tries to bring the old ways back and falls short. Because no one does silence like Anastasia did. No one makes a room colder just by being remembered. By the early 2000s, most of the 5 families looked more like spreadsheets than street crews. The golden days of control, of quiet cash passing through butcher shops and bakeries, had given way to credit card fraud, internet gambling, and union pension schemes that read more like corporate embezzlement than gangland power moves. And still, in a back room in Bensonhurst, or an aging restaurant in Little Italy, if a deal started to get out of hand, too loud, too messy, someone, inevitably, would say it. Albert wouldn't have let it go that far. It wasn't nostalgia. It was a kind of quiet reprimand, a memory masquerading as a warning, because Albert Anastasia had become more than a man. He was now a metric, a question. Is this clean enough to pass the old test? And more often than not, the answer was no. You see, time had not softened his reputation. It had clarified it. The way glaciers seem sharper the longer you stare. While other mobsters faded, names distorted, mythologized, worn down by movies and memoirs, Albert remained fixed. No audio recordings, no flamboyant interviews, no celebrity trial footage, just fragments, whispered stories, grainy photographs, and a barber chair no one wanted to sit in. In a way, his legacy survived because of how little he left behind. There's a power in minimalism, in absence, in doing just enough to be remembered by how you made others behave. One former federal prosecutor put it this way in a 2007 panel on organized crime. Anastasia ran on fear, yes, but it wasn't the fear of violence. It was the fear of letting him down. He created expectations, and in his world, disappointment was the ultimate crime. Many people still think that Albert's greatest weapon wasn't the knife or the gun or the clenched fist. It was the pause, the beat before a decision, the moment when the room went still and every man asked himself, "Did I say the wrong thing?" That's how you lead without raising your voice. But Albert's legend didn't grow in a vacuum. It was carefully cultivated by the vacuum after him. Once he was gone, the machinery got squeaky. Men stepped forward who shouldn't have. Flash replaced function. And in every chaotic decision, people remembered the absence of the man who used to say more with a nod than others did with threats. There's a rarely discussed moment from 2004. A Gambino capo, facing a racketeering trial, was offered a deal. Testimony for a reduced sentence. The agent handling the case noted that the man sat for almost an hour in silence, staring at the file. Then he said, "You know, when Anastasia was around, we didn't even have files." He took the full sentence. Why? Maybe pride, maybe guilt, or maybe, in that quiet courtroom, he felt the old eyes watching. And let's not forget the symbols. The cigar, forever unlit, always present. It became a shorthand, a visual metaphor. In TV shows, when a boss needs to exude silent threat, he's given a cigar, not to smoke, but to hold. It's Albert's shadow in the frame, a subtle nod to the man who weaponized stillness. Even barbershops, those innocuous temples of male routine, never quite recovered from his death. In mob folklore, the chair became sacred, off limits. Some say curses attached to it. Others say it became a reminder. No place is safe, not even the one where you're most vulnerable. Towel draped, neck exposed, eyes closed. That's why Albert's death resonates the way it does. It wasn't just a hit. It was a breach of ritual, a sacred space turned crime scene. And in that reversal, A message was written in blood. Even the king bleeds when he forgets his own rules. So what do you think? Is a man's legend made by how he lives or how he falls? Because Albert lived by the blade, but died by routine. The very predictability he taught others to exploit became his undoing. And in that irony, his story gained something tragic, not sympathy, but depth. He wasn't a hero, he wasn't misunderstood. He was exactly what he was meant to be. A system, an algorithm, a code of conduct and cufflinks. And maybe that's why he endures, because codes outlast kings. And when the dust settles and the other bosses become punchlines or ghosts, Albert remains a question. What would he have done? And more importantly, would it have worked? Let's go back, just for a moment. Not to the end, not to the barbershop, but to the beginning. A boy on the docks, eyes sharp, shoes thin, hands already stronger than they should be at that age. Umberto Anastasia, fresh off a ship from Calabria, had no plans. No dream of being a don. No fantasy of commanding death with a glance. He just wanted a job, a way to stay above water. And yet, some men arrive already aligned with gravity. He didn't climb so much as settle into his place, as if the world already had a gap carved out for someone like him. One who could see all the noise, all the confusion, all the messy scrambling of men trying to look dangerous, and simply step through it. There was no ceremony when he entered the life, no movie moment montage, just 1,000 small decisions, 100 clean favors, and a silence that expanded with every whisper. By the time anyone noticed him, he was already necessary. That's the part people forget. Albert didn't force his way in. He was invited, because real power isn't taken. It's offered by those who are too afraid not to. And so he rose, efficient, absolute, unflinching, until one October morning, he sat in a barber's chair and didn't get back up. They say he looked surprised, that in the instant before the bullets tore through the clean air of that basement shop, his expression flickered, not with fear, but with realization. Not why me, but of course, because a man like Albert knew the rules better than anyone. And he knew, deep down, that if you teach others how to strike, one day they might do it with your own rhythm. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who created Murder, Inc. was murdered with efficiency, quick, public, precise, a message, an ending, and yet, not the ending. Because Albert Anastasia's death was not a period, it was a comma. He lingers still, in the back rooms of old restaurants where no one orders pasta on Sundays, in the shadows of dockyard cranes that still creak in the wind, in the pauses between sentences when men who know better choose their words too carefully. You can feel him in places that used to be louder, where silence has settled in like dust, and no one dares wipe it away. Even now, if you stand near the old Park Sheraton, renamed, renovated, rebranded, you'll feel it. Not fear, exactly, but weight. Like walking through a room that remembers something it isn't allowed to say. You might glance at the ground floor windows, half expecting to see a flash of gray wool, a sliver of white towel, the flicker of a man's reflection in a barbershop mirror that isn't there anymore. So what do you think? Can a ghost be loud without sound? Can a man's legacy exist between sentences? Because when you strip away the myths, the headlines, the FBI files and black and white photographs, all that remains is tension. And Albert was tension, coiled, controlled, complete. Not because he liked the violence, not because he enjoyed being feared, but because, in his mind, the world worked better when it was afraid of what might happen. Not what would, just what might. That uncertainty, it was his greatest masterpiece. Now, we ease into a softer breath. The room grows quieter. You may find your eyes heavier now, the space around you gently fading. That's okay. Let it fade. Let the weight of the story settle somewhere behind you, like a coat taken off after a long day. You're not meant to carry it. Just witness it. The footsteps of Albert Anastasia grow fainter in the mine's hallway, no longer menacing, just rhythmic, like a slow tide that's pulled far back, whispering over cobblestones in a city still dreaming. Even the sharpest blade, when laid to rest, becomes only steel. Let your thoughts follow him into silence now, not with fear, but with understanding. He ruled, then vanished. Like so many stories we only tell at night, and now it's night, so rest. You're safe. We're past the sharp part of the story now. Only hush remains. After the wind down comes the drift, the space where stories no longer shout but hum, where the sharp edges of legend dull just enough to let memory settle in. Albert Anastasia, long gone from the streets he once ruled, still lingers like old oil in the cracks of concrete. He's not a man in these corners anymore. He's an atmosphere, and in the early 2000s, that atmosphere thickened in unusual places. In Staten Island, an upstart crew began reviving old customs. Silence, quick decisions, lean operations. They studied the tapes, read the reports, even asked around for the Anastasia playbook, as they jokingly called it. But here's the thing about ghosts. They don't share their secrets. They only show you what happened to the last man who tried to imitate them. One of those younger captains ended up in the East River. No one claimed it. No one explained it. And someone left a cigar on the hood of his abandoned car, unlit, wrapped in a napkin. It was a message no one needed help translating. So what do you think? Can an idea like Albert still punish people? Because that's what he became after 1957. Not a person, not even a story, a consequence. Whenever the rules were broken too loudly, someone remembered the man who enforced them with surgical certainty. His ghost didn't knock on doors. It slipped into meetings, glanced at your plate, and made you forget your appetite. It's in this spectral tension that his influence carried on. Take law enforcement. By 2010, the FBI's entire structure for investigating organized crime had changed. Gone were the days of trailing wise guys to their social clubs. Now, it was about forensic accounting, server logs, encrypted phones, but in internal briefings, they still mentioned Anastasia. Not as a suspect, obviously, but as a standard. A reminder that the most dangerous men are the ones who leave no trail. One slide even included a black and white photo of him with the caption, "If this man operated today, we wouldn't catch him either." Meanwhile, Hollywood couldn't resist. He became a character type more than a character. The sharp-dressed enforcer with few words and fewer tells. The man who sits in the back of a smoky restaurant and leaves 5 minutes before a hit goes down. No fingerprints, no witnesses, just the bill already paid. They put him in movies without ever using his name. A shadow in The Godfather, a whisper in Goodfellas, a nod in The Irishman. He's the man they imply when they say old school. Because Albert was old school before the term existed, and maybe that's why he doesn't fade. Even his silence aged well. In the mid-2010s, a podcast series on mob history released an episode titled The Man Who Sat Still. It was about Albert, but it didn't begin with the murders or the barbershop. It began with a story from the 1930s of Albert watching two men argue in a Brooklyn social club. He didn't interrupt, didn't scold, just reached into his coat, placed a straight razor on the table, and walked out. The men never argued again. The episode went viral, not because it was gory or dramatic, but because it hinted at something modern life rarely shows us anymore: control without noise. That was his gift. He didn't control through fear of what he'd do. He controlled through fear of what he might. And that ambiguity, that quiet, it still holds power. So what do you think? Can a man whose name is barely spoken in public still shape how people behave? In the bars where his crew used to drink, there are no plaques, no framed photos, But there are rules. Don't raise your voice. Don't flash money. Don't talk about business in the open. They call it keeping it respectful, but really they're keeping it Anastasia. Even the city remembers. Not formally, not with markers or tours, but in the way certain places resist gentrification, in the buildings that never seem to rent out the same first floor, in the barbershop space beneath what was once the Park Sheraton. Still a business, yes, but no one ever uses that second chair on the left. Superstition, maybe. Or maybe the city knows better than to disturb the spot where the last man who truly ruled the underworld let his guard down. Time has a way of rewriting memory, not with malice, but with erosion. Facts blur, names fade, but certain impressions, certain silences, remain stubborn. And Albert Anastasia? He became one of those silences, not filled in, not reimagined, just preserved. By the late 2010s, the world had changed too much for a man like Albert to re-emerge. The streets had different rules. Eyes were everywhere. Satellites, doorbell cameras, surveillance algorithms humming behind every credit card swipe. You couldn't disappear someone in the same way anymore, but that didn't stop people from trying to remember how it felt when someone like him walked into a room. There's a detail from a 2019 organized crime case in Newark. A mid-tier enforcer, facing a federal wire fraud charge, was caught on tape training a new recruit. Not on weapons, not on tech, on posture. You don't need to yell, he says. Anastasia never yelled. You let the room adjust to you. The kid, no more than 25, nods like it's gospel. Because even now, 60 years after that barbershop chair went still, his name carries more gravity than most living bosses. Why? Because he didn't leave behind mythology. He left behind behavior. Many people still think Albert's legacy lies in his body count. That Murder Inc. was his great achievement, but that's a shallow reading. His true legacy? Standardization. He professionalized fear. He treated executions like invoices, handled, filed, untraceable. Before him, the mob reacted. After him, it processed. In one old law enforcement seminar, conducted for analysts new to mob patterns, there was a slide titled The Anastasia Principle. It described 4 bullet points. Control precedes charisma. Action is quieter than warning. Emotion is a liability. A reputation built slowly lasts longer than one earned loud. That's a legacy most CEOs would envy. And yet, there's something haunting about it. Because Albert's restraint wasn't kindness. It wasn't patience. It was optimization. You didn't scream at a broken machine. You fixed it. Or you removed it. There's a cold beauty in that logic. It's why, even in literary circles, his name sometimes slips into unexpected places. One crime novelist once described her villain as a ghost with the smile of Anastasia. She never explained the reference. She didn't have to. Readers felt it. So what do you think? Can a man who vanished in 1957 still be present in how we teach silence? Because that's the part history keeps brushing past. His violence wasn't an excess. It was a tool, used sparingly, with precision. The way a surgeon doesn't wave a scalpel, but cuts exactly once. The few who dared question his methods often met the same end, not in flames, not in spectacle, but in absence, disappeared, misplaced, a footnote in a report with no page number. One former longshoreman who worked under Albert's regime recalled in a late-life interview, "I never saw him. I just saw people straighten up when someone said his name." That's impact without presence, and it lingered. Well into the 2020s, podcasts and documentaries continue dissecting his story. They zoom in on that famous photo, the barbershop, the crumpled suit, the white towel gone red. But even they admit the same thing. The most compelling part of Albert isn't his death. It's the discipline that preceded it. He lived the same way he killed, with exact timing. You didn't get a warning shot. You got the space where a warning should have been. And so, even now, his name circulates. Not as a threat, but as a template in law school hypotheticals, in FBI training modules, in mob eulogies whispered at closed casket funerals. They say, he was no Anastasia. And everyone knows exactly what that means, because in the end, Albert didn't want to be loved. He wanted to be remembered the right way, not as a madman, not as a tyrant, as a conclusion. By the time the 2220s settled into their stride, Albert Anastasia had been dead longer than he was alive. 60-plus years gone, and yet his name still made people pause. Not in fear, necessarily, but in awareness. A shift in tone. A backward glance over the shoulder of conversation. He wasn't part of the modern mafia lexicon like Gotti or Escobar. He wasn't glamorous. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't Instagrammable, but that's what made him powerful. He belonged to an older frequency, a lower hum, one that you had to tune into carefully, one that demanded you lower your voice just to hear it. That, in the end, might have been his most lasting legacy. He taught an entire ecosystem how to listen. In a 2022 roundtable of retired federal agents, they were asked to name the most effective mobster they ever studied. Not the richest, not the most feared, but the most effective. 3 out of 5 said Albert Anastasia. They said his name with respect, with regret. Like he was an opponent they'd never actually gotten to play against, just studied from a distance, like generals reading the tactics of a long-dead strategist. One agent put it like this: you couldn't catch him. He didn't make calls. He didn't write things down. And nobody wanted to flip on him, because flipping on him wasn't an option. It was a contradiction. That's what made him immortal in the criminal playbook. He wasn't remembered because of a trial. He was remembered despite the absence of one. So what do you think? Is it possible to shape an entire generation of conduct without ever giving a speech? Albert did, and not by accident. He studied silence the way others studied law books or boxing forms. It was a tool, a canvas, and in his hands, it could suffocate a room more completely than any outburst. There's an archived photograph in the New York Daily News files, rarely reprinted but chilling in its clarity. It shows Albert at a commission meeting in the early 1950s, seated between Frank Costello and Vito Genovese. Everyone's mid-conversation, hands in motion, lips caught mid-word, except for Albert. He's just watching. One eyebrow slightly raised, eyes fixed, mouth closed. The caption underneath reads, "Stillness in the center of power." No one knows who wrote it, but they weren't wrong. That was his method. Let others move. Let others speak. He'd simply wait and then decide, and that decision was final. Even decades later, that method remains the blueprint for how true control looks. In a 2023 university criminology course on leadership structures in illegal enterprises, a guest lecturer presented 3 models: the charismatic, the democratic, and the Anastasia. The last was described as leadership through consequence, not fear of punishment, but fear of disappointment. Fear of breaking a rule that had never even been spoken aloud. But everyone understood it was there. A student asked, "But how do you enforce rules without writing them down?" The lecturer replied, "You don't enforce them, you embody them. You become the rule." Albert had done just that. He wasn't the enforcer. He was the consequence. And even now that weight remains. Every once in a while, a cold case surfaces from the 1940s or 50s. A missing person, a body in a river, a name tied, however faintly, to a deal that never landed, or a loan that wasn't paid. And inevitably, someone dusts off the file, sees the timeline, and mutters, "Might have been one of his." But there's no way to prove it, because Albert didn't leave trails. He left absence. There's a difference. A trail suggests movement. An absence suggests conclusion. One is a chase. The other is a wall. That's what he built. A wall around his operations, around his thoughts, around his legacy. You could look at it. You could even feel its edges. But you couldn't pass through it, not without permission. And he didn't grant that easily. Not to journalists, not to the law, not to time. The farther history moves from Albert Anastasia, the clearer his silhouette becomes. Not the details, those are gone, or at least unreachable, but the shape of him, the outline, it remains crisp. A man who carved his niche so cleanly that the negative space he left behind became part of the architecture. You feel it not in the stories themselves, but in the spaces between them. There's a courtroom in Lower Manhattan, older than most of the men who've stood trial inside it. Plain walls, a skylight stained with decades of tobacco and whispers. It's said that during the heyday of mob trials, when a certain name was mentioned, the room grew perceptibly colder. Witnesses paused. Juries leaned in. Albert's name had that effect, even in absence. And it's not just urban legend. Court transcripts from the 1960s and 70s show the same pattern. Long-winded testimony until someone drops his name. Then the pace stutters. The language tightens. You can almost hear the room holding its breath through the ink. That's power that outlives its practitioner. So what do you think? Can a man be gone long enough that his shadow outgrows his biography? Because by the 2020s, Albert Anastasia had become less a character and more a calibration, a lens through which modern figures are judged. He wasn't the last of his kind. He was the one who defined the kind to begin with. Take the resurgence of interest in old world mob discipline. A series of criminal networks in southern Italy, in Canada, in Brazil. Each time a new syndicate wants to prove it's serious, the phrase comes up. They run it like Anastasia did. Not like a boss, not like the movies, like him. And that definition? It's not flamboyance. It's not body count. It's not speeches. It's structure. A perfect example. In 2024, a high-level arrest in Toronto pulled back the curtain on a modern crime ring. The headlines buzzed about wire fraud, crypto laundering, the usual checklist. But buried on page 3 of the court documents was a note from a surveillance transcript. The ringleader, frustrated with one of his men, reportedly said, "You think you're made because you bought a suit? Anastasia would have had you teaching manners in a ditch." The courtroom laughed. The wire room did not, because beneath that bravado was a code. And codes, even borrowed ones, leave fingerprints. Albert's code was written in omissions. He didn't have a motto. He had a method. One veteran mob lawyer, now retired, once described it like this. With most of these guys, you cross them and you get a warning. Cross them again, you get an example. But with Albert, you didn't get warnings. You got memory loss. No one remembered you after, and that's what made him terrifying. He skipped the escalation. He saw waste as the enemy, not the act, which is why, strangely, some of the men who worked under him described him with reverence, not affection, but something bordering on respect you couldn't help but give. One associate, interviewed at 94 years old for an oral history project, spoke of him this way. He made you better, not because he inspired you, but because you didn't want to disappoint him. Disappointing Albert wasn't dangerous. It was final. He didn't believe in third chances, sometimes not even second ones. He believed in frictionless operation. If you interrupted the flow, you weren't reprimanded. You were removed. That clean break thinking, that ability to sever without sentiment, made him uniquely suited to his era. and uniquely unfit for the ones that followed, because after him came the age of drama. Tapes, trials, grandstanding, theatrics. Albert would have hated it. He wasn't built for sound bites. He was built for stillness, for the subtle, seismic shifts that turned tides without fanfare. Even his enemies respected that, Frank Costello once remarked. Off the record, of course. He wasn't a man you negotiated with. He was a man you avoided disappointing. That may be the clearest summation anyone ever gave, and it explains why, even as the years pass, his name has not softened. It has not become a t-shirt, or a mug, or a hashtag. It remains crisp, because there's nothing ironic about Albert. He didn't die misunderstood. He died understood exactly as intended. By the time the second decade of the 21st century faded into the third, Albert Anastasia had become something rare, a relic that hadn't rusted. He existed in the collective memory of both the underworld and its observers as a fixed point, like an anchor buried too deep to uproot. New names came and went, flashy, loud, digitized, but has stayed motionless, not from neglect, but from deliberate preservation. He had achieved what few figures in organized crime ever managed: timeless relevance without overexposure. Think about it. His face isn't printed on posters. His voice isn't found on audio reels. He didn't give testimony. He didn't sell out memoirs. And yet, when modern documentaries trace the history of the American Mafia, they have to pause at him, not to explain who he was, because most people already know, but to explain why everyone remembers. He's not a celebrity, he's a standard. Many people still think that's what separates him from all the rest. There's an underground card game in Queens that's been running since the 1960s. Same room, same table, different faces over time, sure, but always one rule above all else. No talking about the old days unless you can match the story. And the ultimate trump card? A personal Anastasia anecdote. A man once claimed he saw Albert turn a backroom dispute into silence with a look. He described the atmosphere change as, like the oxygen got scared. The room went quiet. Nobody topped that. And in a culture where legacy is currency, that silence is worth more than any pot on the table. The thing is, Albert never asked to be remembered. He made forgetting him impossible, because his power wasn't just in what he did, it was in the certainty with which he did it. There was no ambiguity, no fumbled messages. If Albert was involved, the outcome had already been decided. That's what haunts even now, because the modern mob, what's left of it, can't replicate that kind of clarity. Surveillance and media have stripped away the mystery. Everything is a text message, a news leak, a federal document waiting to be unsealed. Albert, on the other hand, he was a blank page after the last period. There's a bench in Fort Lee, New Jersey, near the neighborhood where he once lived. Locals walk by it every day, unaware of the ghost who used to stroll past, unhurried, jacket always crisp, cigar always there, but never lit. The older residents remember. Some nod without speaking. Others change the topic if you ask. Not from fear anymore, but out of etiquette. Because talking about Albert casually feels like putting your elbows on a church altar. You can, technically, but something in your gut tells you not to. In 2026, a graduate thesis from a criminology student at Columbia University studied behavioral residue in post-Cosa Nostra subcultures. One chapter focused entirely on Anastasia. It called him the non-character, stating, he lacked the modern tools of mythology, charisma, confession, controversy, and that made him more powerful. Because all we know about him is filtered through other people's behavior. The paper argued that Albert's strength came not from domination, but from definition. He defined what would and would not be tolerated. He He defined how far too far was, and he defined the silence between thought and consequence. So what do you think? Is it possible that the most dangerous men are the ones who don't tell their own story? Because in a time when everyone curates their narrative, Albert let his echo do the writing, and still it writes. He's referenced in mob funerals, quietly, not as a warning, not even as a legacy, but as a reference point, a way to say, this was someone who understood the work, that's how they phrase it. Never murder, never terror, just work, because that's how Albert saw it. Not art, not spectacle, just maintenance. A man gets out of line. A debt goes unpaid. A promise cracks, so you fix it. Then you sit down, drink your coffee, and go home. It was never about rage. It was about rhythm. And that rhythm, it's still ticking, somewhere deep in the bones of the city. In alleys that smell like metal. In bars with no music. In men who don't flinch, but still remember what it means to lower your voice when a certain name floats in the air. Albert Anastasia is long gone, but the rules he enforced, they're still in effect in the far corners of the underworld, where stories are traded more carefully than money, and silence is the only real currency. Albert Anastasia remains a whispered benchmark, not for style, not for legend, for effectiveness. The man who could remove chaos like it was clutter on a desk. And as time moves forward, as generations of gangsters become fewer, less disciplined, more reckless, Albert's legend only sharpens. You see it in the way his name is used, rarely and only when it matters. He's not referenced to boast. He's invoked to correct, to steady the room. The way a photograph of an old general is kept in the back of a bar, not for nostalgia, but as a reminder of what happens when things aren't handled with precision. Many people still think his most enduring contribution wasn't Murder, Inc., or even his leadership of the Gambino family before Gambino. No, it was the framework he left behind, the silent, invisible template that even today influences how certain things are done. And not just in crime. In high-level business circles, negotiation manuals cite the Anastasia pause, that moment of intentional silence used to break a rhythm, to force a response, to own the room. Corporate coaches don't say his name, of course, but the tactic, it's his, because that was always his way. Albert didn't take control, he became it. There's a small diner in Bay Ridge, tucked away behind a hardware store that's changed owners 4 times in the last decade. The booths are cracked, the coffee's average, but the regulars still include old men with long memories. One of them, Dom, or maybe Lou, the name changes depending on who's telling the story, has a tale about the time Albert walked in during the middle of a shouting match between 2 wise guys. He didn't speak. He just walked past them, ordered his usual, and sat down. They stopped fighting before the waitress brought the menu. That's the story, that's all. No fists, no guns, just presence. And that's what makes him timeless. Not the body count, not the notoriety, the presence. Albert Anastasia was not cinematic. He wasn't operatic. He was absolute. Even his enemies, those few brave or foolish enough to speak after his death, couldn't deny it. One rival from an upstart newer crew, long since disbanded, once said in an off-the-record interview, he didn't bark, he didn't bite, he just ended you. That kind of finality doesn't fade. In today's world of digital everything, even organized crime has algorithms. Territories are divided by IP address. Muscle is outsourced. Loyalty is a spreadsheet. But ask any old-timer what's missing, and they'll say the same thing. Anastasia-level certainty. Not that they want the blood, they want the structure. Albert provided that. He was the final answer to questions no one wanted to ask twice. So what do you think? Can order live longer than the man who enforced it? Can a single person embody not just discipline, but the expectation of discipline? Because the strangest thing about Albert's legend is how few people saw him in action. He didn't rant. He didn't explode. There are no infamous courtroom monologues, no tabloid love affairs, no drunken confessions caught on tape. And still, he rules memory. There's a mural in a private club in southern Brooklyn, not open to the public. You have to be invited. The walls are lined with framed black and white photos. Luciano, Lansky, Costello, Genovese. But Anastasia? No photo, just a blank space, an empty frame. Ask why, and the answer comes slow. Because you don't frame gravity. You just know it's there. Maybe that's what Albert truly was. Gravity in human form. Not loud, not fast, just inevitable. And in a world where most legacies fade into noise or nostalgia, his remains sharp. Not warm, not tragic, just sharp. There's a strange kind of permanence in being forgotten the right way. Not erased, just untouched. That's what Albert Anastasia managed. Not because he controlled the narrative, but because he made people too careful to shape it. He left no memoir. No loyal consigliere published his confessions. No film producer optioned his life for the big screen. He became one of the few giants of American organized crime who did not speak from beyond the grave. And yet, everyone remembers. Even those born decades after his death somehow know. A criminology professor at NYU once opened a lecture by asking students to name 5 mobsters. The usual answers came fast. Gotti, Capone, Luciano, Escobar. Then someone whispered, Anastasia. The professor stopped. That one, she said, is the one you should fear the most. Because he's the only one none of you really understand. And that's by design. Design. That word again. Because Albert's life wasn't flamboyant. It was engineered. He made choices like architecture. His silence was poured like concrete. His actions measured like brickwork. There were no spontaneous bursts. Only blueprints. Even in death, his influence was constructed to endure. You see it in the old couriers. The warehouse guys who never made headlines but kept the gears turning. You see it in the way they still use phrases like, keep it clean, Anastasia clean. Not just neat, not just fast, absolute. Many people still think that Albert would have hated the modern obsession with legacy, the endless documentaries, the voiceover-heavy dramatizations, the hashtags and docuseries trying to uncover the real mob. Albert didn't want to be uncovered. That was the point. His greatest weapon was never violence. It was opacity. There's a hallway in a private residence on Staten Island. Nothing fancy, just a long corridor lined with faded photographs. Most are family. A few are business. One frame, however, contains no image. Just a name, handwritten, no dates. Anastasia. When asked, the homeowner says only, that one keeps the others in line. He doesn't elaborate. He doesn't need to. Because there's a moment in every organization, criminal or corporate, when things begin to loosen. Corners get cut. Rules get bent. And someone has to say, we're not going back to before. In those moments, Albert's name resurfaces, not as inspiration, as a boundary. So what do you think? Is legacy more powerful when it refuses to be softened? Because that's the eerie thing. Albert has never been reimagined. There is no wave of pop cultural sympathy for him. No attempt to humanize the man behind the myth. No push to find his wounded childhood or tragic downfall. He doesn't fit the redemption arc. He doesn't even want to. He remains stubbornly exactly what he was, the consequence. And in that, he becomes something stronger than myth. He becomes memory infrastructure, part of the wiring, the kind that makes people pause before they act, that causes men in back rooms to sit straighter when the tone shifts, that stills a room not because anyone's afraid of violence, but because they're afraid of disapproval they can't explain. Even his enemies gave him that. Vito Genovese, who likely greenlit the barbershop hit, never gloated, never spoke publicly about it, never confirmed it, even in private. He treated it like a chess move played under duress, a necessary evil, not a victory. And that silence, that's how you know Albert won, because the man who dies with the last word isn't always the man who spoke it. Sometimes he's the one whose silence you still can't ignore. That's why, even now, when men speak of how things used to be, when they talk about structure, order, discipline, his name sits at the center. Not emblazoned, not elevated, just embedded. Like a steel beam behind the walls of a house everyone pretends they built themselves. There's a difference between being remembered and being consulted. Most people who pass into legend become trivia, dates and death photos, a name in a headline or a caption under grainy black and white footage. But Albert Anastasia didn't become trivia. He became a reference manual in conversations among the few remaining old world operators, those who still remember what it meant to run things without cameras, microphones, or hashtags. His name surfaces with the weight of a tool being retrieved, not a story being told. Anastasia wouldn't allow this, someone might say when the room gets too loud. Anastasia would have handled that before lunch, another might mutter, when a minor dispute gets dragged into its fourth meeting. It's not hero worship, it's utility, because what Albert left behind wasn't just memory. It was methodology, and methods, when good enough, survive their inventor. Take a case from 2027, an investigation into a low-level narcotics syndicate operating in a small coastal town in Rhode Island. The crew is quiet, efficient, and invisible. FBI agents describe their structure as eerily Anastasia-like. No phones, tight ranks, and swift correction of internal mistakes. One agent even finds an annotated version of an old FBI dossier on Anastasia in the apartment of a mid-tier soldier. Underlines, margin notes, as if the man were a textbook. So what do you think? Can a man be gone for 70 years and still be giving lessons? Albert never asked for that, never positioned himself as a teacher. He was too busy enforcing what was to waste time talking about what should be. That's why his code endured. It wasn't philosophical. It was operational. In his world, mistakes were expensive. But hesitation, that was fatal. There's a chilling logic in that. One that corporate leaders now borrow without knowing the source. Books on decisive leadership echo his style without realizing it. They advise, speak less, act fast, accept finality. They're describing him. And yet, for all this presence, all this posthumous influence, Albert never became a cultural icon. Not really. There are no biopics, no glamorous coffee table books, no pop art, because you can't commodify consequence. You can't turn a straight razor into a mascot. What you can do is fear it and respect it. In 2028, a new documentary series airs called Silent Rules. The second episode is about Albert. It's simple. No reenactments, no dramatic narration. Just interviews with law enforcement, historians, and the sons of men who once worked under him. One quote from that episode went viral, not because it was loud, but because it was true. A gray-haired man in his 70s sits in a dark room, hands folded. He looks off camera. "You didn't need to like Albert," he says. "You just had to understand that when he looked at you, your excuses weren't going to matter anymore." That sentence hung in the air like perfume in a closed room, because that's the part people forget. He wasn't cruel. He was incorruptible. Not in the sense of morality, but in the sense that you couldn't plead with him. You couldn't negotiate, joke, cry, deflect. You either did your job, or you became a cautionary tale. He didn't demand perfection, just the absence of excuses. That's a harder bar to meet. And it's why, even in criminal circles now completely re-engineered around digital structures. There's a growing curiosity about how he kept control without devices, no trackers, no texts, just tone, a look, a nod, a silence that made people confess sins he hadn't even asked about yet. They say gravity can bend light. Albert bent conversation. Even now, in forums and books and back rooms, people try to decode him. How did he enforce without shouting? How did he inspire dread without lifting a finger? The answer isn't complicated. He did the work. Every day. No shortcuts. No loopholes. No sloppy killings. He didn't like violence. He respected it. And that respect became contagious. That's why he didn't need henchmen to yell his name. The whisper was more effective, and still is. Because in every system, legal or illegal, there are two kinds of men. Those who make decisions, and those who are the reason decisions get made faster. Albert was both, and no one since has come close. There's a kind of silence that doesn't come from stillness. It comes from consensus, a collective understanding, a mutual, unspoken agreement among men that certain things are better left undisturbed. Albert Anastasia resides in that kind of silence. He is not discussed over drinks. He is not joked about in the way other mob legends are, with exaggerated hand gestures and half-true punchlines. Instead, he's mentioned in tone, in timing, in the way a sentence trails off when the stakes get high and someone says, "Let's not go that route," because that route, it belonged to Albert. By 2030, his name has passed fully into the infrastructure of organized memory. There are still no statues, no squares named for him, no national retrospectives. But his fingerprints are everywhere, in the way serious men run tight rooms, in the way orders are delivered low and brief, in the preference for clean action over complicated emotion. He's not admired. He's implemented. In one of the final surviving mafia family ledgers from the 1960s, unearthed in a Florida safety deposit box in 2029, there's a coded line item under executive adjustments. Historians now believe this was the internal term for Anastasia-style cleanups. No fuss, no fallout, just subtraction. It wasn't even named for him. It didn't have to be, because by that time, everyone knew the playbook, even those pretending they didn't. So what do you think? Can silence echo long enough to become a doctrine? Albert's did, not through reverence, but through repetition, because generation after generation kept borrowing from his model, consciously or not. And the more the world tried to speak louder, yelling across screens, shouting through headlines, the more powerful his method became. One man, one rulebook, zero tolerance for chaos. That's what made him different from the others. Luciano dreamed. Lansky schemed. Genovese burned bridges just to watch the fire. Albert? He trimmed hedges. He didn't build empires. He protected borders. He didn't fight wars. He ended them. Cleanly. And that's why the men who came after never really filled the vacuum. They were louder, flashier, even more brutal at times. But they all lacked something. Restraint. Because Albert understood the thing most killers don't. Not every problem requires noise. Sometimes it just needs less oxygen. There's a prison interview from 2031. A former boss, now in his 80s, serving a life sentence, was asked who influenced him most. He paused, looked directly into the camera and said, "I never met the man, but I ran every meeting like he was sitting in the next room." The interviewer asked why. He said, "Because when you run sloppy, he shows up in your conscience, and that's the last guest you want at your table." Albert had become the ghost of executive function. He didn't just kill people, he removed inefficiency. In another life, he could have been a CEO, a military strategist, a systems engineer, but in this life, he was the architect of stillness under pressure, and perhaps that's why the FBI never caught him with more than whispers. Because by the time they knocked, the air had already shifted. Even his enemies admitted it. Frank Costello, reflecting late in life, reportedly told a confidant, "We all had our uses, But Albert, he was the fix. No flourish, just the fix. And today, even in the rare conversations where his name is spoken aloud, inside documentaries, academic forums, whispered podcasts, the tone remains consistent, flat, measured, grave, because Albert doesn't lend himself to analysis, only to observation. You don't discuss him. You adjust because of him, like turning down your voice in a room you thought was empty, until you remembered whose ghost lingers in the corners. By now, you know the shape of the silence Albert Anastasia left behind. Not a hole, not a crater, but a clean-edged space deliberately carved that refuses to be filled. A silence so disciplined it feels like a presence, like he's still watching, not haunting but overseeing, not bitter but immovable. But the year is 2032, and somewhere deep in the archives of the NYPD, someone finds a faded internal memo from 1954. Nothing dramatic. Just a page stapled to a folder labeled "Do Not Miss File." In it, a detective describes the aftermath of a waterfront killing. No witnesses, no trace, no questions. He ends the report with a single handwritten note. Could be Anastasia. If it is, then it's done. No follow-up, no urgency, just finality. Even then, his name meant closure. But how did that persist? How does one man's logic continue to steer conversations in backrooms 7 decades later? It's not because of lore, it's because of consistency. Albert Anastasia never contradicted himself. He never played both sides, never indulged sentiment when structure was required. He didn't raise his voice because his outcomes raised themselves, and that made him alien, both to his enemies and sometimes even to his allies. One of the last living associates from that time, a man named Salvatore P., was interviewed quietly in 2033. He was blind, confined to a chair, but when asked what Albert was like, he simply said, "Cold, no, just already decided." That phrase stuck, already decided, because it wasn't just how Albert moved, it was how he lived. There were no second takes, no reevaluations, no theatrics. He didn't execute men because of mood swings. He did it because the flow had been disrupted, and he couldn't stand disruption. Even his death, brutal, yes, and very public, seems less like a tragedy and more like a balancing act. The scales tipped. Too many variables, too many enemies. Someone made the call, and as if by muscle memory, Albert's chapter ended as cleanly as he'd ended others. But even that ending didn't break the rhythm, because the rhythm wasn't his to begin with. He just understood it better than anyone. So what do you think? Do some men become so effective that death can't fully retire them? Maybe that's the true legacy. Not memorials, not retrospectives, but adjustments made in real time by men who never met you, because they know what you would have done. Albert became that. He became the man who still gets the final say, not through threats or footage or family bloodlines, but through example, through structure so tight it outlasted the building. It's 2034 now, and in a federal training seminar in Virginia, a young analyst is giving a presentation on historical enforcement models. She speaks about behavioral patterns, chain of command efficiency, and uses the phrase Anastasia ratio to describe a balance between action and ambiguity. It's not from a textbook. She made it up, but the room nods, because even without knowing him, they feel him. That's the difference. Albert Anastasia didn't demand fear. He calibrated it. And long after the violence faded, after the suits changed shape and the cities changed names, his template remained. He was not made of myth. He was made of rules. And rules, when enforced with that kind of stillness, become law, whether they're written or not. So tonight, as we close the book on the Lord of Murder, Inc., let's not linger on the blood. Let's not dwell on the violence. That's not what stayed behind. What stayed was the order. What stayed was the silence that meant something, not absence, authority, And as long as men sit at tables trying to keep the lights low and the margins clean, his name will surface. Not loud, not frequent, but always sharp, because some shadows aren't cast, they're engineered. So now, as the streets of 1950s New York dim behind us, and the echo of leather shoes across marble lobbies fades, take a long, steady breath. Let the chaos unwind from your chest. Picture the tiled floor of that barbershop, not with blood, but with quiet. Picture the way the steam curled from Albert's coffee in the mornings, the way no one dared to sit before he did, the way decisions were made with a glance and then never spoken of again. Let that kind of stillness find you now, not because it's cold, but because it's done. The night doesn't need more noise. It just needs you to remember how calm can be powerful, how restraint can be louder than rage, how a man can define a generation, not through fireworks, but through finish. Let your breathing slow. No need to think about consequences anymore. Not now. The doors are closed, the voices have lowered, the lights are soft, warm, distant. There's just you, and the gentle weight of silence, and the knowledge that some men do not vanish. They stabilize. So rest easy tonight. The work is finished. The rules have been written. And the shadow? It doesn't move. It waits.